Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Faculty in Focus, where we blur the lines between the work done by Ohio State Lima faculty and the greater Allen County community. I'm your host, Maggie Young, and throughout Faculty in Focus, we will explore Ohio State Lima faculty interests and how they relate to the greater Allen County region. Today, I'm thrilled to have with me Dr. Zachary Hines. Dr. Hines is a visiting assistant professor of English. He is a medieval poetry scholar and also studies book history. So Zach, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd love to start off by asking how and maybe when did you get involved in or get interested in medieval poetry and book history?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and to talk to everybody in the Allen County community and the Lima community. It's a good question. And I think a lot of medievalists are often asked about their kind of origin story, like we're superheroes, which we're certainly not.
Certainly are, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I have a good one. I think most medievalists or many medievalists come to it because they love J.R.R. Tolkien, they love fantasy, they love movies about King Arthur, and I like those things. It's just never been the thing that's drawn me to it. And I think the thing that made me love medieval literature as an undergrad was just sort of how difficult it was and how it was still considered English, but it looked completely different, completely foreign and distanced from my reading of 20th century novels or something like that. And so medieval literature, especially medieval literature in English, feels so different and difficult, but also somehow still the same. And I love seeing those connections between the past and the present, which sort of studying medieval literature always brings to the fore.
So then you received a degree in English from Wake Forest, right? But that wasn't your only major, right? You also had a degree in archaeology, yeah? So how did you get involved in that?
Yeah, it was anthropological archaeology. So
okay.
Yeah, it was a traditional four-field anthropology program, and I focused on archaeology. I really liked Indiana Jones, and I think I still really like Indiana Jones. And
you're practically there now, right? I mean, you're a faculty member. I'm waiting for you to kind of take off from Lima, Ohio, and go on these fantastic missions, right?
The difference is I would never sneak out my window to avoid seeing my students in office hours.
Fair enough.
But in doing archaeology, and we might want to talk a little bit about my experience doing archaeology abroad, I realized it wasn't all sort of tomb raiding, and it was more a kind of scientific experience in the lab. I really liked working with objects. And so what I was really looking for post-collegiately was a way to kind of combine my interest in reading and my interest in literature with my interest in objects and material culture. We can talk about this in a minute, but studying both of those things as a double major in college really gave me the opportunity to kind of flex all the different muscles at once and wear a bunch of different hats in my kind of academic experience.
Well, I love that. I mean, you did find that perfect kind of balance between the things that you liked about both disciplines. That's great. So you got to go abroad. So can you tell me a little bit about from where you went after your undergraduate studies?
I was very lucky to be able to study abroad multiple times as an undergrad. So I was an athlete, so I couldn't really leave campus during the year, but in the summers, I was able to apply for fellowships and scholarships to study Spanish language in Querétaro, Mexico, and to do an archaeological field school in Portugal with my brilliant undergraduate professor who took students out to Portugal every summer. And I got to spend a term at Oxford, really digging into not just the literature, but the kind of medieval culture that's still in many ways, the atmosphere that still presides sort of in Oxford. And the experience of studying abroad really opened a lot of doors for me, not just in terms of networking, but also just in terms of understanding that the world is a much bigger place than the communities that I grew up in, and coming back to those communities and being able to say, here are a bunch of ways of thinking about the world that are different from the ways that I was growing up to think. And so I was very privileged to be able to move abroad after college to do a master's degree in London at King's College London, which is one of the oldest English departments in the entire world, maybe the oldest, where famously Virginia Woolf was a student. That experience was just sort of mind-blowing for me, and it exposed me to new ways of thinking and new ways of writing. And I realized that there are a lot of different ways of coming at the kind of questions that we find in literature. And sort of one of the things I love most about teaching is being able to encourage students to bring their own interests and questions to texts, many of which always surprise me, that students, have all these different backgrounds and interests and things that they can bring to a text. So, I know that Lima is really working to expand our study abroad programs. And I think, it's a really amazing opportunity for students to be able to sort of get out and explore the world. So happy to talk about that more if you're interested.
Well, I think that experience of broadening one's perspective and finding those diverse perspectives within and beyond a discipline is really, I think, one of the joys of going to school, or going to a school like Ohio State Lima. So after that, then remind me, you went back to the States and eventually ended up at my alum as well, so University of Texas at Austin, where you completed a doctoral degree in English as well, correct?
Yeah, so I moved back to my hometown to work in the service industry. I delivered room service at a hotel, worked behind the bar, did all the kind of stuff while I was applying for PhD programs. And I taught community college for a year in my hometown, which felt like a really nice way of kind of giving back to the same schools that trained me. So I got into UT, and I was delighted to move to Austin and spend 6 more years, really, studying and writing and reading and teaching. And then I moved to Lima for this job. So the experience at UT, I was, really lucky to have an excellent faculty, really brilliant colleagues and fellow graduate students. And that's where, to get back to the question you asked a minute ago, where I kind of discovered book history, which is my kind of subfield, or my kind of scholarly focus. And that's the thing that I discovered that combined my interest in literature with my interest in objects, material culture. And so, book history is in general the sort of study of the construction of physical books and objects, but also the cultures that produce them. And one thing that you find out is that authors wrote in the past with an awareness of what forms their texts would be received in, right? What kind of books, what kind of oral performances. And so book history really allows me to engage with all sorts of different cultures of reading in various forms, material and otherwise.
And I think it's an interesting way even to combine a variety of other fields. I mean, because we think about English as, okay, so I'm going to sit down, I'm going to read, and then I'm going to write about what it is that I read about. But what you're able to do in this field, it seems like, is to combine history, English, writing, even the physicality of creating these objects. And I think that's so fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe how you got interested, or why you were so fascinated by the creation or the processes of creating books?
Yeah, so I think before I really understood that there was this explicit intersection between, reading books, which I love to do, and, digging up objects, which I also love to do. It was actually in my first or second year at the University of Texas, there was a big kind of colloquium series called The Fate of the Book, which was thinking about what the material object of the book will look like in the future, right? With the coming of the digital book and fears, which are, in my opinion, largely unfounded, that material books will disappear from our lives. But all of the speakers there were invested in thinking about books as material objects, and in fact, digital books even as objects that we can study, for the ways that our encounters with them affect our experience of reading. Right. So any student or reader that's read, something on an ebook understands that it's very different from the experience of reading in a material book. And not to say that one is better than the other, but there are people in all kinds of different fields. As you say, this is an interdisciplinary endeavor, but people that are reading, working on psychology and working on kind of neuropathways and the ways that reading is just fundamentally different depending on what form you encounter texts in. So that colloquium series really got me thinking about the ways that books as material objects through history have really affected the way that we've received the text that we think of as being standard or canonical.
Well, and I mean, I think that's just the thing, isn't it? That it's that the books that we read, so if I go to the library and I check out a book and I open the page, and I am one of the people, I much prefer a physical copy. I have e-readers and I have ebooks everywhere, but there's something about the feel and in some cases the smell of a book that I really like, that whole experience kind of invites you into a new world. So, if you ever needed somebody to talk at length about why I believe print books are better, you know where to reach me. But the idea that books they don't like come into the world as a finished product, right? I mean, that they're months, years, decades, even labors of writers and editors and friends who you bribe with coffee to read your stuff. I mean, and then before printing houses again, then how do those books kind of come into being and how do they change? I mean, is that what you spend your time thinking and reading and studying?
Precisely, yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think the holistic experience of reading that you described is one that I think a lot of people haven't been able to put into words, but just know the experience. And when I was at Texas, one of the things I always said is, I asked students, when you go up to the fifth floor, the fourth floor of the Perry Castaneda Library, and it just smells different. Like, why is that the case, right? And they say, well, I have them look at the bookshelves and the numbers, and they realize, well, that's the only floor that has the Dewey Decibel numbers instead of the Library of Congress numbers. And then they start to realize those books are a little bit older and they were produced during a certain period. And actually, there's something physical going on in the books, the decomposition of the glue and the paper that makes them smell the way they do. And their minds are kind of blown that something they just thought of as like a weird quirk of the physical space of a library actually affects their experience of being in the space and reading the books. And your point about the long process of producing a book, or even I would argue a text, is exactly what I think about. So your first point about producing a book is really important and interesting. I think you were thinking in terms of text also, but I work on early books. So, the production of a book before the advent of print in the 15th century might have taken months or more of labor, right? Because an individual is producing the parchment, the animal skin on which the books will be written. And, later towards the 15th century, we start to get more paper. Somebody is handwriting, copying from another book into that book. And so, a big, thick choir book might be, 100 animals, 200 animals that gave their lives to the sort of production of this book. So the labor and the animal cost is sort of on one side, and the other is the other thing you were getting at, and that's the production of the text. And I think one thing I tell all my students on day one, especially in my early classes, my pre-modern classes, is that any text that you encounter in an edited edition or an anthology, especially a pre-modern text, is not necessarily going to be authoritative. And the labor of all of the individual editors are often invisible. So you won't know what changes editors have made to those texts. And so one of the things I do is I study the long tradition of producing these texts. And, for example, Chaucer, who is an author that I study, so someone who died around the year 1400, he was dead before any of the manuscripts that survived to us were produced. So we don't have anything in his hand. And that goes for many, if not most, of the authors before the advent of the printing press, right? With some notable exceptions like Hakluyt and Christine de Pizan. But it's really remarkable then to think about the way, how much authority we grant to the texts of someone that we don't really know what they wrote, right? And that is that of the 70-something surviving Chaucer manuscripts, Canterbury Tales manuscripts, his sort of like most famous work. None of them are the same. They're all different. So the tales appear in different orders. They have different readings, different individual words and phrases. And so, in the 19th century, it was the job of editors to really try to figure out what was the best manuscript, right? Or can we trace backwards using, very much a kind of genealogical stemma, right? Can we figure out what is the most authoritative manuscript, what Chaucer may have written? And I'm actually interested in coming at it from the opposite direction, which is thinking about the way that the early readers, especially in the 15th century, would have encountered Chaucer, because they might not have known any better, right? The manuscript that they had was authoritative for them. And so, really, for both students and anyone that I talk to, I really encourage them to think twice about the text you're reading. And if you're reading something modern and the author is still living, you probably have a pretty good idea that the text looks the way they wanted it to look. But when we're reading anything early, including Shakespeare, right, another author who we think of as being so central to the tradition, we don't really have anything in Shakespeare's hand, right? There's one possible small exception, but we don't know what Shakespeare wrote. And so it's a really interesting way to think about early authors, especially when we grant them so much kind of power and authority in, the tradition, in the canon.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of fascinating to think about if you were to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is, reading in the 1500s, what would they have been reading? And if you even fast forward then, 50 years later, in maybe a new lifetime, what would they have been reading? How is their experience? And even then after the printing press, what about the physicality of the books? How is that experience then different or similar to what it is that we experience, 500 years later? I mean, it's so fascinating. And you think about, or you read these texts because they're maybe required texts for, AP English or freshman, seminars. And you think, okay, so this is exactly what it is, except that it's been an evolution. I mean, it's grown, it's developed, and that there are people who spend their time figuring out and asking these really interesting and fascinating questions. I mean, like when I was an undergrad, I certainly didn't realize that there were book historians and that like they studied the process of putting together books and that you could have a job doing that. I think I would have liked that. So maybe in my next life, I will do that. That sounds
well,
fun.
I also didn't know that. It was something that I had to come to discover. And yeah, I mean, I ask my students that question, every year, why do we have a required class called Shakespeare? Why do I make you read Chaucer? And, the easy answer is, well, we can learn from the past and, stuff back then was important or Chaucer and Shakespeare invented all of these phrases that we use every day. But I really don't even think that's the most important thing, right? I think really understanding what the canon is, right? So the canon is the kind of group of texts that we in general, people in general, have decided are the kind of most representative or the best examples of text from any particular period. But the truth is that canon is an invention just like anything else. And, I talk about Chaucer, but again, I don't think anybody was really reading Chaucer during his lifetime, right? He had a couple of friends, probably, maybe a patron, John of Gaunt, but nobody was reading him. And in fact, it's not until 1532, nearly 130 years after he's dead, that somebody says, well, we're gonna find all of Chaucer's works that he ever wrote and put them together in a single volume and print them. And then that person said, well, I'm going to make Chaucer into this great poet, which was a tradition that was started, not long after he died. Someone like Hawkley calls him, Father Chaucer, and someone like Spencer says that he's kind of, the spring from which all of English, came out of, or whatever. And so there's a printed tradition that starts in 1532 that runs up till today. Editions in 1532, 1542, 1555, 1598, 1602, that are just reinventing Chaucer, inventing him as this kind of great poet. And the same thing happens with Shakespeare. So I have above me a facsimile, a reproduction of the first folio of Shakespeare, which is, a couple of his buddies after he died decided that we need to make Shakespeare into this great author. And so they combined all his plays, some of which we don't have any other surviving copies of, earlier copies, right? So some of them were printed in smaller formats. But it's largely these great authors are the inventions of readers and scholars. And so, I tell my students when I teach these kind of historical surveys, one, why do I make you read this hard stuff? Why do I make you read Chaucer? But also to ask them, why are we reading anything in this course, right? What is British literature? And, does Old English count as British literature? Nobody can read it unless they're trained in it. But what is missing, right? And so one thing about studying the canon is that there are a lot of voices that are largely invisible or largely erased from or silenced from the canon. So the canon is traditionally, old white guys who are largely writing, from a position of privilege with a lot of wealth, not always. And so part of my job is to introduce back into the canon some of these amazing texts that we've just sort of forgotten about their existence. And so, I try to balance, it's important that we read a little bit of Chaucer, but, there are other things that we should read too. And that's, again, where I make them think about the politics of putting together an anthology, for example. what you exclude versus what you include is a decision that you're making that really affects the way that we understand the canon.
Well, it then begs the question, what is the next canon going to look like when 100 years from now, what's going to be included from this era? So yeah, whose voice will be heard, whose voice will be prominent? We have, of course, the same questions in my discipline in music. And, when you talk about people who were unknown in their lifetime, but considered masters, I mean, the first person that comes to mind is J.S. Bach. So pretty much like the father of music, and yet he was largely underappreciated as a composer. He was well known as
the father of English Chaucer.
Yeah,
you could make a similar argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's
here's
amazing.
Another class we have to teach together, Maggie.
I can't wait. It's going to be great. Zach and I are going to have a lot of classes and education away experiences. It's going to be great. We're going to be busy. And we'll have to come back for another Faculty in Focus to chat about that a little bit. But I did just want to say that I'm so glad that you were able to join us for this episode of Faculty in Focus.
It's been my pleasure. And, I look forward to, once the pandemic has hopefully faded away, I don't know if that's being too optimistic, that, we'll really be able to engage in the community in a way. I've only been living here about a year, but, I haven't really been able to get out and do anything. So I'm really excited for, the next couple of years here in Lima and being able to hopefully bring my interests into the community, whether or not you guys really want to hear it,
I'm sure we do.
Or something.
It'll be great. I want to say congratulations on joining the select group of Ohio State Lima faculty invited to the Mug Club. I see your Ohio State mug in your background, but you'll get another one, which is part of our focus on faculty scholarship, both inside and outside of the classroom. For everyone here, be sure to check out our other episodes of Faculty in Focus on the Ohio State Lima YouTube channel. And from all of us here at Ohio State Lima, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Faculty in Focus. Until next time.